Hello, and welcome to tonight's webinar on native plant identification. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. You are attending the webinar in listen-only mode, so you'll be able to hear our presenter, but we can't hear you. If you have questions for our presenter, you can type those in the questions panel on the right side of your screen. We'll be covering questions at the end of the presentation. If you don't see the panel, look for the orange arrow in your screen's upper right corner. Click on the arrow and it'll pop out the panel. I am Courtney, and I'm the Community Program Director here at MSHS. And this is the first class in our series supporting our MinSeed Native Plant Community Science Project for 2021. And Stephanie is here to tell us about that. Take it away, Stephanie.
Thank you, Courtney. I'd be happy to. MinSeed, yes, this is a project that the Minnesota State Horticulture Society, the Como Community Seed Library, and the St. Paul Seed Circle are collaborating together this season on to support your efforts to save seeds from native plants. It's called MinSeed, the Native Plant Community Science Project. The funds for this have come from Capital Region Watershed District, whom we are very grateful for the partnership grant that they offered to us. So participants who sign up for MinSeed get to participate in a series of workshops, including the one today on plant identification. We'll also bring you along on the MinSeed iNaturalist project, which is a tool that's on your own mobile devices that can help you identify and log the plants that you are seeing and growing. We're going to be offering a whole series of seed collection and processing opportunities for later on in the season. So we'll get together in person, collect these seeds. These will also lead to seed cleaning events and seed swaps. And then lastly, we hope to we'll have classes around plant propagating using these same seeds.
Awesome, thanks, Steph. And we're gonna have a iNaturalist orientation on May 27th at 5:30, and you can sign up for that at the northerngardener.org website as well. There are also two handouts for tonight. One is a list of resources and the other is a copy of the slides. They're both PDFs, and you can find those in the pop-out panel. And I'm excited to be joined tonight by Karin Jokela. Karin provides pollinator-related technical support and training to conservation planners and farmers, primarily in southern Minnesota and western Wisconsin. She has a strong background in pollinator conservation and agriculture, and she holds a master's degree in ecology and evolutionary biology from Iowa State University, where she studied skipper butterfly conservation and grassland restoration within agroecosystems. Take it away, Karin.
Thanks, Courtney. Well, that was a great introduction. So I probably don't need to say too much here on this slide. So instead of launching into the presentation, what I'd like to do first is do a couple of poll questions to get a sense of who's in the audience, your experience level, a little bit about your interests and why you're here. So Courtney, could you pop those up? Okay, so. Do I need to do anything for you, Courtney?
Nope, it's launched and we're getting responses. We're at 50%, so I'll just give it another couple seconds and then I can close it and share it.
Perfect.
90%, 92, we're almost there.
Wow, thanks everybody.
Yeah.
I'm not getting a preview of the results, so I can't wait. There's a lot of anticipation.
Okay, I'm gonna close it right here and share. So it looks like there's 10% with no experience, 71% with some experience, 18 are amateur experienced enthusiasts, and 1% is the professional proficient.
Okay, that's great to know. That's about your experience level and or your confidence. And then I'm curious why you're all attending.
So I have launched the second poll. How do you expect to apply this training? The majority right out the gate is to identify the native plants in their garden.
Okay.
Although to identify plants in large scale restoration plantings is creeping up there. Give it just another minute or two or second or two here. Okay, so it looks like 59% are to identify the native plants in my garden, 23% to identify plants in large-scale restoration plantings, 11% to train others on native plant ID, and 6% to collect seed from native plantings, and other described in the chat. So I don't see any descriptions in the Q&A section.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you everybody for participating. Helps me get a sense of how to frame every one of my slides, whether you're talking about sort of smaller footprint plantings or these large scale restorations where it's sort of a question of plant materials too. If you're working with transplants or if you're working with like a seeding where you might end up with a lot of other kinds of weeds and things in your mix. So, okay, that's really great background. Maybe I will move ahead here and make sure I'm on the right screen so that I can move forward. You're seeing my slides advance, right? Courtney or anybody? I'm gonna trust yes.
You're good.
Before I launch into the content, I did want to say a couple of things about the Xerxes Society, the organization for which I work. We are an invertebrate conservation organization that works to protect invertebrates and their habitat. We take our name from the Xerxes blue butterfly, this butterfly up on the right here, that's was the first butterfly to go extinct due to human-influenced habitat loss. We're based out of Portland, Oregon, but we have staff all over the country. I'm in southeastern Minnesota down by Cannon Falls, and I cover ground in Minnesota and in Wisconsin. And I do want to just pause here for a second to say we're a membership-based organization. So if there are any of you who are in the audience, I just want to give you a shout out right now and thank you, because we could not do this work without you. You are so important in making this collective project happen. So thank you. A couple of things about the organization. We have several program areas. Our largest by far is our Pollinator and Agricultural Biodiversity Program. That's the program that I work for. We also have a really amazing endangered species team that works on all kinds of different invertebrate species like monarchs, bumblebees, fireflies, freshwater mussels. We have a pesticide protection team that helps a lot of municipalities work through best management plans. They confer with the rest of us on best management practices and things for agricultural practices. We have a budding urban conservation program, largely driven by this program that we took on a couple of years ago called Bee City and Bee Campus USA. We have a few of those cities and campuses in Minnesota. And then we also have other initiatives like Be Better Certified. It's kind of a certification program for farmers and food supply chains to recognize and implement meaningful habitat on farms, and then have that kind of carried up in a seal, kind of like the organic standard, but you would see a little Be Better Certified seal on your product that would show that the farms that supply the food for that product have meaningful pollinator habitat on their farms. So we do a lot of different things, especially working with private landowners, farmers all over the country. My role is a little unique. Most of my funding comes from a partnership between General Mills, Xerxes, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. That's the branch of the USDA that's responsible for helping farmers with any kind of conservation. And in that role, I help the staff of NRCS, kind of helping them learn about pollinator habitat, I help farmers directly. I help the state office. I can get into the field and help with habitat evaluations and planning for specific farms. Do a lot of field days, or at least I used to do a lot of virtual things these days, but you know, all the same, outreach kind of things. And then I also do a lot of seed mix revisions and writing technical documents and that kind of thing. So just a little bit about my particular role. And now we can finally get into the content here, which is probably of more interest to you. So this is kind of where we're headed. I want to just say I just provided one slide, basically. What is the importance of native plants? I suspect a lot of you are already converts, so to speak. I'm pretty interested and knowledgeable about the importance of native plants, but it's worth noting. I want to talk about some tools and resources for ongoing learning, because I'm sure you're aware there's no way I can teach you all about how to identify native plants in an hour here. So there's going to be, it's a lifelong project, and there's a lot of resources out there to help you kind of continue that learning. We'll go over a little bit of terminology that'll help clarify certain things throughout the rest of the presentation. We'll kind of start at the high level of plant family characteristics and then drill down into specific profiles of native species and a couple of weedy species, only because they will co-occur with your native species, and it's worth noting which ones are likely there. And then I'm just going to give you a couple of ideas for upcoming trainings that Courtney hasn't already mentioned. And so that's where we're headed. Yeah, so here, the importance of native habitat. There are so many reasons why it's important. There's tons and tons of benefits of native plants. First and foremost, they increase biodiversity and landscape functionality. So they're doing a variety of things in our environment, things that we don't even recognize often. Importantly, they're providing food and shelter for wildlife, largely insects first. They're the first ones to convert those plant materials into food that then can get fed up into the food chain later on. So birds are eating caterpillars, frogs and reptiles are eating insects. You know, so the plant material needs to be there as the base, this diverse plant network, in order to attract the diversity of insects and so forth. Native plants are adapted to local climate and soil conditions. They're therefore more resilient to unpredictable weather and all this climate variability that we're seeing. They have increased functionality because they can filter stormwater. They increase infiltration in the ground. They can clean out pollutants that would otherwise end up in our waterways. When you're gardening with native plants, they require less water and inputs than your average conventional garden. And this last point about native plants potentially having the opportunity to counteract this, what I call the extinction of experience. And maybe this is just the mother in me, but we are experiencing just an unprecedented loss of connection with nature as a society. And that has really detrimental effects on our public health and our overall well-being. And when we garden with native plants, when we have native plants in our landscapes, that allows our children and the next generation to get to know these species and the insects and the wildlife that they attract. I don't want my daughter to grow up not knowing the beauty of these plants and the really fascinating creatures that they attract. So that's one of my motivations for gardening with native plants and for promoting native plants in our landscape. So I don't know if that resonates with you, but hopefully some of those benefits do resonate with you. Oops, too fast. So it's worth noting that we have such a diversity of native plants in Minnesota. Plants that occur in Minnesota in general, not necessarily native, but most of those are native. We have over 2,100 plant species that occur in Minnesota. So in order to learn all of those, that's kind of a lifetime of learning. It requires a really healthy amount of curiosity and maybe a minor amount of obsession to learn some of these things. But be patient with yourself. This takes some humility, and I'm only going to be able to go over a few of these today, but hopefully it will inspire you to learn more. I want to talk quickly about a few resources. If you aren't already familiar with Minnesota wildflowers, this is just an incredible tool that we have here in Minnesota that not a lot of other states have. So I would highly encourage you to get to know that website. There's also an app associated with it. It has identification tools. It's really technical, but also accessible in terms of the language they use to help you identify things. Illinois has a kind of similar site, which I put up there. I mean, there's a lot of overlap in our flora, and there might be a few things that aren't, really appropriate, or, there's a lot of overlap. But they use a little bit of different language, and so that might be helpful as you're learning to identify things. I put up the Prairie Moon Nursery website, and that's not necessarily as an endorsement for that particular business, but that they do put up this huge library of information, cultural information that you can peruse without purchasing anything. You learn about the seeds per ounce, like the seed size. They have beautiful pictures that you can learn about the germination requirements of different species. It's just a really wonderful website to explore. And then this is sort of web related, but also, learning about, a lot of you I suspect are Minnesota Horticultural Society members, but you might also consider joining some of these other groups where there's a lot of potential for learning, like the Minnesota Native Plant Society or Wild Ones, a Master Naturalist group, Audubon Society. Even if you don't join as a member, all of these have web interfaces, either through social media or their own online platforms, where there's a lot of potential to learn and to help you identify plants. I want to go through a few other online resources that are also linked in that handout. So this is just one of them that was just published out of the Bismarck Plant Materials Center. This is an NRCS institution. And this is a Forbes seedling identification guide. This is meant for conservation staff to go out into the field after they've seeded a large restoration and to be able to identify with landowners small seedlings. So it's pretty simple guide, like a little pocket guide. So far, I haven't seen it in hard copy yet. It's brand new, but it is available as a PDF online. It gives just one simple photo, a few identification techniques, worth exploring for sure. In contrast, this is a similar guide that NRCS created many years ago, but it has a little bit more content. So you can see there's 2 pages for every species with a little more detail, a couple more photos for each species. It includes a few of the grasses, just a little bit more description for you. Available again as a PDF, and that's linked in that handout. And then some of you may be participating in this MinSeed seed collection project. And so I thought I would recommend this series of fact sheets as well. So this is put out by Lake County, which is a county in kind of the Chicago region. And it, again, because it's not in Minnesota, there may be a few species highlighted here that wouldn't occur in Minnesota, but they're exhaustive fact sheets. This is just a little screenshot of one of the fact sheets from the Fall Prairie Forbes, but they have all these other fact sheets available where you can see kind of the plants in their senesced stage, the stage where most of your typical plant ID guides aren't going to show this kind of image. So what does the seed head look like? What do the seeds look like? And even in these fact sheets, they also include some invasive species or weedy species that might co-occur at the same time that you wouldn't want to collect, but they give kind of ID tips for those too. So that's another place to explore if you're thinking about collecting seed. There's also tons of plant ID apps and tools to use. I love using iNaturalist and Seek. It sounds like there's going to be another workshop in this series that will go into more depth about iNaturalist, but I really encourage you to start exploring it now. And iNaturalist and Seek are not just for plants, they're basically for all flora and fauna. It's like a global naturalist network. So I often use it for insects because you could be an entomologist for 10 lifetimes and not know it all. So my whole iNaturalist library pretty much is insects, trying to explore all the insects that occur on my farm and in my environment. There are a few other plant ID apps that I'm not very familiar with, but I've seen other people recommend, called Leaf Snap and Picture This. Yeah, I guess you could give them all a try. See what you feel most comfortable with. I put a couple photos up just of a hand lens. These are just tools that you might find useful. A little hand lens to see small parts of plants that would help you key something out. Macro photography lenses that can be really cheap and can also help you zoom into small detailed plant parts. Yeah, worth exploring. I don't have personal experience with those, but a lot of people recommend them. And then just a few plant identification books. This is just a small sampling of some that I have used and really love. There's a lot of them out there, but I guess they range from sort of simple to pretty technical. Like Wildflowers in Minnesota, that little green book in the upper right, that's really a simple introductory book, like a little pocket guide that's just showing you flowers. It's not showing you any vegetative characteristics. Whereas Minnesota Flora is a pretty hefty book. That's a really technical guide that I've used a lot doing field surveys in Western Minnesota in prairie regions. It's the book that is the most well-worn in my library. But often when I use that book, I have to carry around this other yellow book, Plant Identification Terminology, because it is technical in its language. And so if any of you have used technical plant ID keys, you probably are aware that there's about 50 different terms for plant hairs, or 50 different terms for the teeth on the margin of a plant, of a leaf. And so sometimes a terminology book can be helpful. A good weed book is useful. I really love that Wildflowers in Wisconsin guide. A lot of great pictures, good range maps, good, just simple language to understand. So here's just a few, there's a few more listed in that handout as well. And then I want to go over a few botanical terms that might help us as we talk about specific species in subsequent slides. First, just alternate branching versus opposite branching. So an alternate branch, you can see here I have in yellow, it's sort of the leaves come off the stem in a zigzag pattern. They're alternating along either side of the stem. And that contrasts with opposite branching. This is a milkweed here, where the leaves come in the stem, into the stem, join the stem at a paired attachment. So it's just the leaves are opposite. And then there's a third kind of a leaf attachment, which would be called whorled. And this can be basically several leaves coming in at the same point on the stem. This can be 3 leaves or 5 leaves or 6 leaves, multiple leaves in groups around the stem. And then moving on to some leaf shapes. This is what we would characterize as a compound leaf. So this is a little seedling of partridge pea. And what you can see is it just germinated and created those 2 little, what we call cotyledons, the first 2 leaves that come out. And then the compound leaf that's encircled in yellow, that's actually the first true leaf of partridge pea. So those are just little leaflets that make up a full leaf. There's also a ton of different language, and I'm just giving you a little taste of botanical terms, but for example, palmate, which would be palm or hand-shaped. This is a prairie violet, Viola palmata, right? So you can, once you start to learn some of these key terms, you'll start to understand even the species names of things a little bit better. Here's another one, dentate or toothed, lobed, serrated, all different ways of characterizing the teeth on the margin of a leaf. Here's another interesting one that can give you a little clue about certain species. Perfoliate. Perfoliate means when the leaves surround the stem and make it almost look like one full leaf. So this is a Triosteum perfoliatum, which is horse gentian, I think is the common name. And so a native plant around here. And so these key terms, these key like Latin and Greek terms show up in the species names. And finally, ciliate. This is a native loosestrife Lysimachia ciliata, and that's named for that fringed hair on the leaf stem there. So just like I said, just a little taste of different botanical terminology on herbaceous plants. I want to go through a few on grass structures. We've got auricles and ligules. Those are some of the key ones. Auricles, like you can see on the wheatgrass here on the right, these are pretty pronounced. They're kind of like clasping the culm or the stem of the grass. The ligule is that kind of fingernail-like piece that's in the back of the stem. And you can see down on the reed canary grass ligule, that's a really pronounced ligule right there. And it's sort of sitting within the collar region. So a few grass terms there. There's a lot of different terms when we talk about flowers. This is just your classic biology 101 flower picture, where we've got these different parts that are part of the female apparatus, the pistil, and because we're not talking about pollination, I'm not going to go into all that detail, but there's the male part, the stamen, which is comprised of the anther and the filament, and that's usually a little bit more obvious. So when we talk about learning some of these botanical terms and how they might be useful when you're keying out a plant, the things that are going to be useful to know are how many petals there are, can you identify the stamens, can you count the stamens, and then knowing where the sepal is. So it's that kind of leafy material below the petals. So for example, you can see here, obviously all these native plants that occur in our area don't have flowers that look like this diagram, right? They're more complex. But if you look closely, you can start to see some of the anthers. Remember those parts where the pollen or you can see some of those anthers sticking, or the stamens sticking up with a little anther on top that's carrying the pollen. You can see some of those sepals underneath the flower petals. Just a few terms that when you start to look at some of these flowers. I know I'm moving pretty quickly, but I'm hoping that you're all accessing the PDF so that you can go back and refer to things that I'm kind of skimming through fairly quickly. There's just so much content that I want to share with you. And so, yeah, so I'm going to jump right into a few family characteristics. I just chose 8 prominent plant families that we see in our landscape. We have so many different plant families here, thank goodness. I won't be able to go through all of them, but these cover a lot of ground. So we've got grasses and sedges, right? The grasses are jointed and hollow and usually round. So this is a component of grasses that I didn't talk about in that previous slide, the node. There's 2 joints coming together around this little node, that purplish part. Sedges, the saying goes, sedges have edges, and what they mean by that is usually 3 edges. Usually they're triangular. However, I will show you in a few slides here that some grasses have some edges too. So 3 edges for sedges. Asters are a big family, really diverse. But one thing that they all hold in common is that they're made up of composite flowers. So these are small flowers all in a disc. And I zoomed in really close here to a purple coneflower because you can see each one of those little flowers in there is its own individual flower that gets pollinated and creates a seed. So asters are a huge family. The mints, they are characterized by a square stalk. Usually they have opposite leaves. They're very aromatic. Most of our herbs are in this plant family: basil, rosemary, mints, of course, bergamot, lots of different species in there, usually aromatic. Milkweeds, they are, they have this namesake of milkweed because they have a milky latexy sap. So when you break the stem, you'll see that. They usually have opposite leaves, so they join at the stem there. The flowers are all 5-parted, so 5 petals, 5 little horns, 5 stamens. Pretty easy to recognize once you start to get that in your mind's eye. Mustards are like the Brassica family. They have, when you see them in flower, they have 4 petals, and that's really distinctive. They always have 4 petals. And often they have a sort of characteristic Brassica smell, right? And I've included a photo here of something called Dame's Rocket, which we'll probably start to see in about a month flowering. It's an invasive species, and a lot of people mistake it for phlox, prairie phlox. And phlox actually has 5 petals, whereas Dame's Rocket will only have 4 petals. So that's just an example of when you start to see some of these minor details, you'll recognize what plant family it is and it will help you learn to identify it. Parsley and carrot family, they usually have these what we call compound umbels. It's sort of like an upside down umbrella in these flowers that are terminal. They have this really characteristic shape, like a Queen Anne's lace, if you're familiar with that species. Often they have like a taproot, like a carrot, right? Or a parsnip. So those are pretty characteristic features. And then the pea and the legume family. So these are, they have these really characteristic irregular flowers. They usually have pea-like pods. Usually you'll get to know this. Usually is sort of the standard for a lot of plants, which can be very aggravating. Usually legume family species have pinnate leaflets. So that's basically sort of feather-like. These are all leaflets that comprise one leaf. Okay, so I want to just dive right into some of the grasses quickly here. So now we're getting into that phase where we're going to go through some species profiles. And I tried to include in all these species profiles various images that would help with identifying at different stages. So either at a seedling or a flower head. A lot of your plant ID apps and books will feature just the flower. So I'm not going to focus as much on the flower because that's a little bit easier for you to learn on your own. I'm going to focus on some of these lesser known features that aren't featured in all the guidebooks and that kind of thing. So I'll start with some of the major native grasses that you see in restorations and so forth. The first one, big bluestem, it's known as called like turkey foot. And one of the things that has sort of purple nodes and stems, has sort of hairs along the collar area. And yeah, pretty easy to identify, especially as it starts to shoot up that flowering stem. The Indian grass has these horns on either side of the collar. That is really easy to see once it starts to shoot up its flowering stalk. So even before you see that bronze beautiful seed head, you're going to see those little horns on either side of the ligule. Little bluestem and side oats grandma. Little bluestem is one of those grasses that sort of feels like it has edges because the little seedlings are very flattened at the base. They kind of have a blue base, and this actually carries through not just as seedlings, but even as the mature plants. They're really flattened. You can feel the 2 edges. Once they're more mature, they're fairly easy to identify because they're really beautiful bunch grasses that have these beautiful fluffy white seeds in the fall. Side oats grama is pretty similar because it has really characteristic spikelets that have, there's no other grasses that have seeds like that. But you might need to identify it before it gets to that stage. And one of the things that helps me identify it is these little papillose-based hairs on the leaf margin. And when I worked as a botanist for the DNR, I once worked with this technician who called this plant, forgive me for being a little crude here, but she called it hairy pimple grass, because when she would pick out a little leaf, she would see those little pimples on the side of the leaf margin and that little hair coming out of it, and that was her identification cue. And there are no other plants that are like this. So I'm trying to give you little anecdotes that might help you remember this long term. Okay, the ryes, these are at least wild rye these are cool season grasses. Pretty diagnostic when they have flowering heads because they're beautiful, droopy. Some of them are more erect, but they're pretty diagnostic kind of ryes and wheat grasses. But before then, you'll probably be looking at the ligule, or I mean the auricles, that often are kind of clasping the stem in this that really like finger-like way. Quackgrass, which is a non-native, is in the same genus and it has the most pronounced auricles. So that's really exaggerated. And it's worth noting that these can kind of wear down as the plant matures. So this is really in the immature phases that you'd be looking at that. Switchgrass is a warm season grass. Has this really hairy collar region, triangular collar on the leaf blade. That same technician of mine called this one hairy armpit grass because you just pull down the leaf blade and see how hairy it was there. So that can be kind of diagnostic feature for switchgrass. I'm gonna speed through a lot of these because I'm just watching the time and seeing how much content there is to cover. I was ambitious. So yarrow is one, Achillea millefolium, many leaves because the leaves have just tiny, they almost look like little feathers. Few little seedling photos here. They have a really distinctive smell. They can look very similar to Queen Anne's lace, so those are the two that might confuse you. Yarrow is a native and Queen Anne's lace is not. They both have pretty distinctive smells, so that would be one clue. Anacisip is one we use a lot in restorations and in gardening. It's in the mint family. It smells sort of like licorice, really beautiful smell. The undersides of the leaves kind of have a whitish color. They're kind of waxy leaves. The flower heads are pretty obvious. It's pretty easy to identify them once they're flowering, but the smell is probably the most diagnostic thing. Milkweeds, there are many different kinds of milkweeds in Minnesota, at least 14 species. Mostly you will identify them by that sap or by their typical seed pods up on the upper left. Some of them are clonal, like the world milkweed in the center. Some of them are just have one, they don't spread. Of course, if you find a monarch egg or monarch caterpillar on the leaf, that's another indicator that you're looking at a milkweed because monarchs can only use milkweeds as their host plant. Milk veg is one that isn't used as much in gardens, but we certainly use it in restorations a lot. Has these long leaflets. It is a legume. There's a lot of different species in Minnesota, especially as you get into western Minnesota, drier prairies. Canada milk vetch is the one that you would see most often in restorations and a little bit in gardens as well. Partridge pea is one of our few native plants that we use that's an annual. It does self-seed and can be really prolific in certain soils, can even sort of serve as a cover crop. Has these beautiful yellow flowers with a little red tinge in them. The pods are just very pea-like. As they get more mature, they'll turn red and sort of spin open. The seeds are pretty big and can be really useful for food for wildlife. Coreopsis is one that we use a lot in gardens and in restorations. There's one that gets used, I think Coreopsis lanceolata gets used a lot in gardens, but it's really not co-evolved in our native plant communities in Minnesota very well. Mostly what you're going to see in our native plant remnant communities is Coreopsis palmata, bird's foot Coreopsis, named for this leaf, right? It's palmata, it looks like a hand, or at least a bird hand. Has sort of waxy leaves. It can be rhizomatous, so spreading underground lateral roots sideways. Really, really important for prairie restorations, though. The prairie clovers, mostly purple prairie clover and white prairie clover, what you'll see in gardens and restorations. They can look pretty similar in the seed head form. The way to differentiate them when they're not flowering is that the white clover has much bigger leaves, or leaflets, I should say, whereas the purple prairie clover has much thinner, wiry leaves or leaflets. So it's pretty easy to see side by side when they're growing. And then of course when they're flowering, it's quite obvious to see the difference. Purple coneflowers are in the Aster family. There's really only one that's a true native to Minnesota, and that's narrow-leafed coneflower. So you can see the two different maps on the bottom there. These are maps where it's showing the county where those plants naturally occur in plant communities. And so narrow-leaf coneflower is a shorter plant. You see it in western Minnesota, drier prairies, skinnier leaves. But of course, their standard purple coneflower is used across the United States. It's obviously draws in lots of pollinators, is used in gardens, and is used medicinally. So you should learn how to identify that as well. Has wider leaves, much taller plant. There's also a pale purple coneflower, which is really like it doesn't occur in Minnesota naturally. It does sometimes get used in landscaping, but that would be a third echinacea. Boneset and Jopaiwi, these are two that I put on the same slide because they used to be part of the same genus, Eupatorium, and now they're separated into Eupatorium and Eutrochium. They naturally occur in sedge meadows, like you would see in the middle there, surrounded by like tussock sedge. Jopai has whorled leaves, so remember there's like 5 or 3 to 6 leaves joining at one spot on the stem. Boneset, Eupatorium perfoliatum, remember it's that same term that I say, it indicates that the leaf is wrapping around the leaf stem. So that's a really easy way to identify that before it's flowering. Sneezeweed sometimes gets used in landscaping. It's a rather tall plant, also occurs in sedge meadows. I really love it. It has sort of this gappy tooth kid kind of, I don't know, it makes me smile. Really cute button flowers that you can see those seed heads afterwards. Even in this photo with it flowering, you can see some of the seed heads forming afterwards. The most diagnostic thing to use when identifying sneezeweed in the field before it's flowering is these winged stems. You can really feel that. And it's just basically the leaf blade extending down the stem. Some of our native sunflowers that are perennial, not just annual sunflowers. There's a lot of them. There's at least 10 species in Minnesota. Most of them are rhizomatous. They range in size and shape. Some can be kind of tricky to differentiate. So sometimes you really do need a key. Let's see, I would say the clonal aspect of them is really diagnostic. You can see that split seed head again. That's that Aster family compound flower where each seed is creating in the flower head. False sunflower, very closely related to Helianthus, but it's Ileopsis. These are more short-lived perennials. They don't spread underground sideways. They have opposite leaves. They're a little bit, short-term perennial, but they can be quite aggressive when you have them in your garden at first. The blazing stars are a really fun category of asters. If if you're familiar with them at all, you probably know that they attract monarchs like crazy, especially a few species. They can be a little tricky to identify before they're flowering because a lot of the leaves often look similar, numerous narrow leaves that almost look like they're whirling around the stem, although they're just alternating. The two that are most tricky to identify or to separate out is the rough blazing star and the meadow blazing star. You can see on the lower right here, the rough blazing star, the florets kind of attach directly to the stem, so there's no little stalk, whereas meadow blazing star can have a lot of variability, but they have little stalks. So it can be a small stalk, just a 1/4 inch, or it can be really long stalks. They kind of dangle off the spike stem there. Almost all of the seedlings look similar with this sort of spike first true leaf, almost looking like grass-like. Lobelia and Cardinal Flower, very beloved by hummingbirds and therefore gardeners. These also can have a little bit of a milky sap, although it's thinner and not as latexy as the milkweeds. All of them have a very similar seed head, and the seed is tiny, like hundreds of thousands of seeds per ounce, just looks like dust. They often prefer wetter areas, but pale spike lobelia is an upland species that really likes a little bit drier sites. I know I'm speeding through this, sorry everybody, but I hope that you can use this resource, the PDF, later on throughout the growing season here. Bergamot and dotted mint, two species in the same genus that are both very aromatic. Bergamot is more wide, the common, wild bergamot is much more common and widespread and has versatile like soil adaptations, whereas dotted mint, or sometimes called horse mint, really prefers dry soils, dry sandy soils, and in those areas it can really just colonize, like this site in Dakota County. Both really important for pollinators, a really distinctive smell. And the beard tongues we often use in plantings because they provide a really nice spring bloom. They all have kind of a spike with tubular flowers, some smaller, some larger. Bumblebees really love going in there. You can kind of see them, their little bumblebee butts kind of wiggling around in there. Yeah, they usually have opposite leaves. They often have seed heads that look sort of similar to this one, but they range in different sizes. So some of them are a little bit smaller. Coneflowers, we see a lot in restorations and in gardens, especially the yellow coneflower or gray-headed coneflower, which is really a little bit tall. The long-headed coneflower, or sometimes there are varieties of it called Mexican hat, which have red petals. That's really a Western Minnesota species, prefers drier sites. Just an iconic prairie species. The seed head of gray-headed coneflower has a really unique smell, sort of lemony. I sort of have a fetish for crushing those seeds and collecting those seeds just because I love the smell of it so much. So that's something to look forward to in the fall. Black-eyed Susans, we have 3 different species that occur in Minnesota. Rudbeckia hirta, the Black-eyed Susan, is definitely the most common, is used all over the place in restorations. This is a really common picture for an early season or early maturity restoration. So in the first year or two, you'll just get this huge bloom of Black-eyed Susans, and then as the plant community matures, that will kind of fade out. But Black-eyed Susans have really fuzzy leaves. That's a really easy way to identify them as a seedling. 2 of the species are biennial, so that means that they flower in the 2nd year and then they die. Whereas Rudbeckia laciniata, cutleaf coneflower, that's a more long-lived perennial. Prefers like shadier sites, savanna sites. Cup plant and compass plant, these are 2 species that are also iconic prairie plants. Again, we've got cup plant, that perfoliatum, named because the two leaves surround the stem and almost create a cup that holds water, right? Just so you can see down there in the center left. That's a cup plant leaf. They're gigantic plants, both of them. Whereas compass plant, Silphium laciniatum, you know, laciniatum, when you look at these root words, it means cut into narrow, irregular lobes. It's perfect. So just similar, similar plants in terms of the texture and their bloom period, really different moisture requirements, and belong in different kind of plant communities. Goldenrods are way too diverse for me to even explain in detail here, but I just chose 2 species that are commonly used in gardens and in restorations that are pretty different. The showy goldenrod, Solidago speciosa, kind of has waxy leaves. And I think, personally, I think the inflorescence, that flower head, kind of looks like the shape and the size of like a soft serve ice cream cone. It always has that conical structure. Whereas like your Canada goldenrod kind of splays out sideways and has all kinds of irregular shapes. But showy goldenrod always has that cone feature. Whereas stiff goldenrod has really stiff leaves, kind of grayish rough leaves, and almost has like an umbel shape, where kind of like a Queen Anne's lace or something. Asters are another really diverse group. We've got at least 20 different native species in Minnesota, and they can be really confusing for collecting seed. So it's good to identify them during the growing season and maybe mark them out before collecting seed, because the seed can all look pretty similar. And yeah, anyway, so these are just 2 that we use in restoration plantings a lot. The New England Aster is quite a bit taller. It has dark, beautiful purple flowers with a stark yellow center. One of the diagnostic things about New England Aster is that the leaves really strongly clasp the stem. So you can almost see little arms branching around the stem. Smooth blue aster has a little bit of that trait. The leaves are smooth and waxy, and it has little lighter blue flowers. It's a shorter plant. Again, these are definitely worth paying attention to. If you're trying to collect seed, pay attention to them while they're in flower. That's the easiest time to start to identify them. Spiderworts, we have a few different species in Minnesota. The one that occurs most naturally in our native plant communities is Prairie Spiderwort. You can see on that range map, although we do have 2 others that occur in Minnesota, and I would say those 2 other species get used in landscaping a lot, in gardens. So you might want to, even though you might not, like you might be in Dakota County or Hennepin County, it might be occurring in your county because somebody planted it. It's not necessarily part of a restoration or a remnant plant community, but you still might need to know how to identify it. These are monocots, which basically means they kind of look like grasses. They, especially at the early immature stages, they have 3 petals, early spring blooming species. They're beautiful. They can be rhizomatous, meaning they move underground laterally. Yeah, just quick overview of spiderworts. The vervains, we have a few different species in Minnesota. 2 that get used most often in plantings are blue vervain and hoary vervain. Both can look kind of similar at the seedling stage. They prefer really different soil types. So the hoary vervain prefers really dry sites, especially like pasture sites, upland pastures. Whereas blue vervain, Verbena hastata, prefers more like a sedge meadow, wetter species. They can look a lot like nettles. Of course, they're not going to sting you, but they can have that sort of look at the immature stage. And then lastly, for the native plant tour, this whirlwind tour of profiles are some of our Alexander. So golden Alexander, or heartleaf Alexander. Again, these are two species from the same genus that prefer sort of either upland sites, drier sites like Heartleaf Alexander, or wetland or sort of medium soiled sites, which would be Golden Alexander. Both are pretty common in Minnesota in restorations and in gardens. Really important plants for pollinators, especially early season species. They can look a lot like wild parsnip, so it's worth learning to identify the two different species. The Golden Alexander will bloom a little bit earlier than wild parsnip, and it's much shorter as well. And then later after that, you'll start to see wild parsnip blooming. So wild parsnip is becoming a problem across the state, so definitely something to start to get familiar with and try eradicating. And certainly don't want to collect those seeds thinking it's Golden Alexander. The seeds look quite different, but yeah. So there are a few plants, and you can just kind of, since I'm not going to be able to go into detail on the plant ID tricks of all of these, what I would consider this is sort of like a checklist of species that you might want to note before you do a planting, whether it's a large footprint planting or even in your home garden. You might have some of these species there that could be really problematic, especially if you're starting from seed, but even if you're starting with transplants, these can be really challenging, competitive species to work with that you want to control as much as possible before putting in your native plants. So smooth brome, and this is a common like pasture grass, turf grass. One really easy technique is that all the leaves have this little M, or sometimes people say it's a W print. You can kind of see it there in the left picture, the smaller inset picture. It's like you can feel it between your fingers. It's like a little, I don't know, print in the leaf that looks like an M. Reed canary grass is really aggressive, but it has that, before it's flowering, you can see that really strong, clear, tall ligule that looks like a fingernail. No other grasses have one that's quite so big. So that's something that you can just pull down and see it. They're really quite big leaf blades anyway, but yeah, big ligule. Quackgrass has these, I mean, you might be able to identify it because you're pulling it out of your garden and seeing just how long those runners are, the rhizomes. But another way to identify it would be kind of those clasping auricles. Leafy spurge is another one that don't even bother trying to dig it up. It has these runners that go all laterally underground, really, really challenging once it gets started. And like these are all rhizomatous. So yeah, Canada thistle is the same way. If you try to till it or dig it up, that just makes it kind of angrier. It thrives when it gets tilled. So yeah, learning about these plants and how their behavior can help you figure out how to best manage them. So yeah, that's one of a few of the challenging ones. These are a few more that you might want to identify before you get started on your planting. Is knapweed. This is kind of a drier site species, biennial or short-lived perennial. Bees love it, and so they pollinate it happily, and then they create a whole bunch of seed that then spreads all over. So that's a really challenging one to deal with. Wild parsnip and wild carrot are both in the carrot family. They're biennial, so in theory should be somewhat easy to manage through mowing or something like that, but they create tons and tons of seed that I think can last in the soil for a long time. Some of our introduced legumes, like some of the clovers, they can be actually quite good resources for pollinators. The good nectar source. I mean, all beekeepers love sweet clover, but it can be really problematic in landscapes when you're trying to do a native plant restoration. Same with red clover. It can really persist. These hard seeds stay in the soil for a long time. When you're trying to get prairie established, you often do a lot of mowing to kind of allow those slow growing native plants to establish, and that can just cause these clovers to proliferate because they're really adapted to mowing. So those are a few species to notice and maybe try to control before you plant. And then after you plant, you're likely, unless you use a heavy mulch or certain contexts, you really might have good weed control. But in a lot of contexts, you're going to have some weeds that occur in the early stages of your planting. And these are mostly annuals. There's one exception here, which is the woody species down on the lower right. But the annuals don't concern me too much. They can get really problematic, like if you have more than 50% of your planting are these annuals coming up, then you'd want to do some kind of management to mow them off or before they settle out of seed, to kind of rescue your native plants in there. But in general, they can be kind of scary in the first couple of years, but they can be easily controlled. They will fade out as you sort of nurse along your native species. So again, I'm not giving you necessarily identification tips here, but I'm just giving you a little checklist of species that are likely to occur. You might want to get familiar with them on Minnesota Wildflowers or some other resource like that, so that when you do see them, you don't panic. It's okay that they're there. The one exception here are these woody species that you might want to take note of species that are occurring around your planting site, because if you're constantly having the seed rain, you're just going to have to be aware of that management that you're going to need to do long term. So Siberian elm can create tons of seeds that will kind of pollute a native planting. It can be challenging to manage, and even box elders can do that a lot too. So this is, I'm winding down here because I know some of you might not be able to stick around this long, but I just want to highlight two trainings that are coming up that they're really geared towards conservation professionals, but I would say they're really accessible. They're kind of low layman's kind of level introductory trainings that it might be fun for you to tune into. One of them would be a really great, is coming up on Monday. Both of these are on Monday afternoons at 1 o'clock. And they're just sort of a next launching off point from this workshop. So native plant communities, Megan Benage and Becky Marty do a great job from the DNR presenting. And then there's a species, since I didn't really go over any native plant identification for woody species, nor did I do anything too much for woodland type species, the Dendrology 101 might be another good way to learn some of the basics of tree and woody shrub identification. It's a cool platform too. It's a platform where you actually, as a participant, get to like interact on the screen of the person presenting. It's designed so that you learn a lot and you participate a lot. So worth considering. Xerxes has a lot of YouTube videos and things like that. Not a lot on plant identification per se, but a lot about pollinators and natural history and all of that, if that's the kind of thing that interests you. Xerxes also has tons and tons of really cool resources to help you with your restoration planting, seed lists or plant lists. Almost everything is downloadable as a free PDF that you can just download for yourself and distribute to your friends and neighbors and whomever. And then, yeah, I just want to definitely leave this open for questions. I know I sped through this. Hopefully you do have some questions that I'd love to chat with you about. Just leave you with this image of my own daughter and my in-laws. You know, this is so important to me to raise a generation of kids and a community that values these native plants. And I hope that we can start to propagate them more and see them more in our landscape. So thank you for joining in tonight. Thank you for being part of potentially the Minnesota Seed Project, and just engaging in this lifelong learning process. So yeah, Courtney, feel free to shoot some questions at me, or whoever it is that's moderating the questions. I can't remember. And of course, reach out to me afterwards if you have ongoing questions as you digest some of this material, because it was just a lot that I threw at you. So keep my email there and send me whatever questions you have.
Okay, Karen, Carolyn Blake would like to know, is bamboo considered let's see here, a grass?
It is. Yeah. I'll admit that I'm not very familiar with it because it's not a native plant here. It's an Asian species or Asian group of species, but it is a grass.
Okay. And then we have Kathy Hartley, who wants to know, do you have any recommendations for native plants for woodlands that are deer resistant?
I have species that are recommended for woodlands, but I don't really believe there is such a thing as deer resistant unless you enclose it or exclude deer, at least in urban areas. Or, I mean, deer, I wouldn't put anything past them if they're hungry. If they have tons and tons of food in the environment, then they might not bother it. But their stomachs are adapted to eat just about anything and everything. So even plants that are advertised as deer resistant by nurseries, I would take with a grain of salt. So you could start there. Like, for example, Prairie Moon Nursery has a way to filter plants by deer resistant species. So you could start with that, but I would also just prepare yourself if you put things in, because if you have a lot of deer pressure, it's just going to be a hard thing to avoid unless you really protect the plants.
And then Kirsten Eulenberg just wants to say thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And Courtney, the PDFs, will those be sent out in an email following the webinar?
I know that the handout will. Sometimes the PDF of slides is too big to send out, but people can feel free to email me. I can put my email in the chat and I can send that out.
Yeah. Can you also just briefly describe how people can download these PDFs that are offered up here?
Yeah. So there should be a panel in the, I believe it is the upper right corner that you're looking for, the orange arrow in your screen's upper right corner. You click on that arrow and that will pop out the panel. And then from there, there should be a little triangle that says handouts, and you click on that and then you can download the handouts from there.
And that pretty much covers our questions.
Perfect.
Looks like there's one more from Linda.
Oh, did I? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, it says, yeah, Linda Olson is wanting to know, I have showy goldenrod planted behind my anacissus in my rain garden. The showy goldenrods aren't doing very well, so can I move them?
I think you could. Yeah, if it's, whenever you move a plant, I would baby it a little bit. Make sure you dig it wide enough so that you're getting almost all the roots, and wherever you transplant it, dig a big enough hole so that you're giving those roots a lot of space, and then water it in. They do like a little bit drier sites and they like full sun. So I have seen them kind of languish, especially with aggressive competition like anacissus next door. If the soils are a little bit too rich, or if they're not getting enough sun. So yeah, I mean, definitely play around. I mean, that it is, I often get a lot of people who think that once they put in their native plants that like they've conducted a restoration and they should just leave it. But I mean, this is, you really need to be proactive and engage in this planting and make it how it's going to work for you, how you're going to learn best. I mean, you can play around with it. It's not an untouchable thing. So you can dig things up and move them and see if something else works.
Karin, do you have a favorite way of controlling thistles?
Well, I mean, the easy answer is for some of the biennial thistles like plumeless thistle or bull thistle. Those are they're going to create a big rosette in the first year, and then the second year they're going to send up a spike, and that's more or less easy to just whack off that spike and prevent it from flowering, and it might even keep showing up in that third year trying, you know, to send up a flower. But those are fairly easy. The Canada thistle is hard. Sometimes smothering, sometimes you have to give it, you know, I just try to pinch off any little leaf that's coming up in my garden areas in particular, like where I've got native plantings. I'm just really vigilant about not allowing it to have access to the sun so it can feed its vast root system. I'm trying to constantly deplete its resources in its root system. So I'm just constantly pinching off little leaflets that are coming up, and hopefully over time the native plants that I put in really get established and can kind of hold their own against the Canada thistle. If you walk away for a few years, the Canada thistle will return, but it just takes some attention, and there's a lot of other techniques for larger footprint control that I could go into in detail with specific details of your situation, maybe in an email or offline somewhere. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
I've mostly just like to smother them with billboard tarps for about 4 weeks, and that takes care of them.
I mean, does it take care of them in like year 3 after that treatment?
No, like 4 weeks. If you cover like the whole area with a billboard tarp, it, like, I would say within 4 to 6 weeks they're done.
Okay, I mean, I would definitely try that. I remain skeptical about its long-term control, because I have seen them.
If any survive on the edges, they're gonna come back, but
yeah,
them completely.
Smothering is definitely a good technique to try to reduce their capacity to photosynthesize.
Yeah. It looks like William has a question about, do we need to control native thistles in an early restoration?
If you're confident about it being a native thistle, then there's no reason to control native thistles. They are extremely important for pollinators, for a lot of, even just as host plants, for some native caterpillars. And Xerxes has some good tools for identifying native thistles versus non-native thistles. And boy, I'm always taking an opportunity to promote native thistles and their value. So even if they're abundant, all the native thistles are biennials. So they might take off right away in a restoration and then kind of peter out. And so the more you can create seed in your restoration to keep them going, I mean, there's no reason to control them, in my opinion.
Carla McKenzie is asking any hints on how to control burdock.
It's a tricky one because it likes disturbance. It creates tons and tons of seeds. The pollinators help create all those seeds, but it is a biennial. And so with some pretty routine management of mowing in the first couple of years, before you put in the native plants, then you should be able to control it a little bit. Of course, there's always a seed bank, and so you might end up weeding burdock out around your native plants once you put them in. And yeah, they're tough. I mean, they're but again, once you get some of the native plants in there that can hold their own, then they're there holding a space, but they're also recognizable to you, and you can just hopefully weed out those other undesirable things that are finding tiny little niches around your native plants. But early control is through mowing, or maybe hand digging if you have no other, I mean, soil disturbance sometimes opens up opportunities for other weeds to get started. So Sometimes I just like, especially when you've got biennials, just keep mowing to prevent seeds from going, like prevent you from creating more seeds.
Okay. And Linda Olson is wondering when butterfly weed emerges in the springtime. She's not seeing any leaves yet.
I know. I have been closely monitoring some of mine. They have just started to poke out. I'm in Goodhue County, just down by Northfield, Cannon Falls, and they're like less than an inch out of the ground in a very sunny spot that has no competition. So that should be probably the earliest emerging. Others that have more shade or have cooler soils may still be a little slower. So don't panic yet. It might still be there.
And Kirsten Eulenberg is asking, can you share any experience with flame weeding for weed control to avoid herbicides?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I didn't mention here is that my husband and I also run an organic farm, and I should say he really mostly manages it. But we use flame weeding a lot to manage annual weeds that are coming in before you plant, or even after you've planted, but you've seeded something, you don't expect that seed to germinate for a little while, but meanwhile other plants are coming up. And it can be an effective short-term control. Some plants are more susceptible to that than others. The more established a plant is, the less susceptible it is to fire, because often there's some reserves down in its roots, or maybe it has a growing point that's kind of buried under the soil somewhere that can reemerge. But yeah, flame weeding can work. I mean, you have to be a little careful in certain landscapes, especially around, if you have any other fuels that could carry fire, you'd want to be careful. But yeah, I mean, that can work. It's not a silver bullet for everything.
And Donna Long is asking, can you use corn gluten to control early weeds?
I don't have personal experience with that. I've heard of that every once in a while. I really can't comment too much on that. We haven't trialed it with Xerxes work much. It sounds like something that probably Wild Ones folks might know a little bit more about. But I'll look it up, and I can follow up with somebody if they want to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you so much, Dawn and Stephanie. And thank you everyone for attending. Check out more information about our MinSeed project on the northerngardener.org website. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar and the resource handout for sure. If you are not a member of MSHS, now is an excellent time to join. Members receive not only our award-winning magazine, but also discounts at nurseries and greenhouses, free tickets to the local home show, free webinars, and more. And your membership dollars also allow us to bring great programming like this to all of you. On behalf of the Minnesota State Horticulture Society and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.